If we look at two aspects of the problem of terrorism, one is obviously state terrorism, and the other is vigilante terrorism. State terrorism involves the use of weapons of mass destruction or otherwise against civilians. And we have, for instance, in many places on the world today, we have peoples that live in a state of terror because of the threat either of the use of weapons against them or because of actual aggression that's occurring at any given time. If you look at the real central problem that we have here, though, I would say it's obviously use of vigilante terrorism. Now, in Islamic law, it is absolutely prohibited for individuals to take the law into their own hands. But part of the problem in the Muslim world is that there has been a marginalization of Islamic scholars to such a degree that they have had almost entirely no access to educating their populations. Their own institutions have been so neglected. And in the areas where state religion is supported, in certain countries, certain strains of Islam that are not normative, but in a sense are actually considered extreme in reality, are the ones that have been encouraged in the past, although that's beginning to change. So the Muslim world in itself has immense problems, from the very top to the very bottom. I mean, you have deep-seated social problems in the Muslim world. Now, here in the West, what can we do to alleviate those problems? I think essentially, one of the things that we can do is recognize that if we continue to treat the branches or the bitter fruit of these problems and not go to the root of the problems, they're not going to go away. And I think Ireland is a good example of that. If you look at the problems in Ireland with Irish terrorism, it wasn't until certain issues were truly addressed that the situation began to change. And I think that in the Muslim world, if it's going to be an eradication of individuals, of groups, what will continue to happen is that you will continue to find young people seeing this as a tax on their culture, on their society. I mean, this is what I feel. And when I actually met with President Bush, one of the things that I said was that my biggest fear is that if the Muslims themselves are not brought on board to fight this problem, that you're going to get a polarization in the Muslim world. And the Muslims are going to see themselves as once again being the victims of a crusade, a religious crusade. And this is what is happening. If you look at Iraq, Iraq has succeeded in, again, politicizing many, many Muslim youth. If you look, for instance, at the RAND report, which is an attempt to understand the Muslim world, the RAND report suggests, for instance, presenting secularism as a counterculture to Arab youth so that they can rebel by becoming secular as opposed to becoming religion. I mean, these are the type of solutions that are being offered to the highest levels of state in the Arab world. And I think that this, in essence, is a tragedy. That instead of going to the root problems, and I would say, if we look at root problems, I would say first and foremost, one of the gravest problems that we have is the fact that we have allowed certain aspects in the Muslim world to continue on for so long, the promotion of despotic governments in order to sustain the national interests of Great Britain, of France, of Germany, of the United States. So despotic models have been allowed to continue on. And now, changing horses in midstream, suddenly the Arabs are being told that we're going to bring you democracy. Well, the Native Americans have a saying, white man speaks with forked tongue. And this is part of the problem, is that the hypocrisy in the past has been so great, because this has been told in the past, that people have lost any sense of credibility. I mean, this is how so much of the Muslim world now views us. I think, in reality, in the West, have failed to truly appreciate the degree to which the Muslims really feel that the West is responsible for so many of their problems. It's very easy for people like Fareed Zakaria to say that the Muslims need to get over that. But the truth is, the interventions that have been going on, the amount of wealth that has been coming out of the Muslim world in terms of oil and otherwise, and the lack of actually giving anything back by supporting the governments that in turn end up sending all of the money back to the West. And I'll give you one example. The 7th largest purchaser of arms in the world is Saudi Arabia. So the very wealth, the oil wealth that brings so much money into the Middle East, that wealth is in fact being recycled back into the West. So in fact, very little is actually being given to the people in the end. And so many of the people there, I think the political nature of the Middle East and of Pakistan and India is so much greater. The political environment that people live in. People are deeply engaged in politics in those places. They talk about politics constantly. I mean, it's an obsession, really, in the Middle East. Here, where we live in reasonably civic societies, and things tend to, in some ways, move along, and we do quite well, people tend to fall asleep, be more concerned about football matches and who won this game and who won that game than the real matters that concern societies. That is not the case in large parts of the world. These people are very politicized and really struggling with these issues day in and day out because they feel them and they experience them. And so I think that we here have an immense responsibility, I think, to show more goodwill. Instead of constantly berating these people and attacking these people for their inabilities, for their incapacity to change their situations, to actually extend to them this hand of goodwill. And I would give you a very profound example of this in the past. And I think this castle reflects an immense amount of Islamic influence for anybody that studied the Renaissance and the sources of much of this type of design and architecture. The Muslims gave an immense amount to Europe during what is called the Renaissance. And there is only one example that I know of a society that really tried to give back, and that was Sicily. There was a period of about 100 years in which the Christians of Sicily were not only offering asylum and an immense amount of toleration and support of their Islamic communities, but there was so much mutual benefit that that knowledge actually became a major source of the Italian Renaissance. And so there is an immense amount that people here can do. There's an immense amount of goodwill that can be shown. And I think that this room here, the people in this room, the intelligence in this room, the influence in this room, I think that you yourselves can do an immense amount here in Wales. And now I really like to look at a few things. One, the second major problem that I have with terrorism is that I do not believe in any way that it is really, in the light of other threats, is a major threat to us. Martin Rees, who's the Astronomer Royal in Cambridge, has written a book called The Last Century, in which he feels that this 21st century might very well be the last century of humanity because of what we're being now confronted with in terms of catastrophes. That's hard information for us to absorb. How do we process that? How do we process, for instance, that 90% of the waters that human beings fish have been depleted in the last 20 years? How do we process that? And yet I heard that confirmed. I read it originally in The Guardian and then heard it confirmed by an oceanologist in Boston. How do we process that? It's very difficult to process. How do we process the fact that 50 million people now are being faced with death in Africa from AIDS? How do we process the fact that the United States is spending 0.13% of its gross national product on aid, and yet it's spending 51% of its tax dollar on the military-industrial complex? How do we deal with the fact that 50% of our scientists are working in defense in the United States? I mean, if we have such immense problems as a human community now that we are facing, that we need to really recognize that our energies need to be directed towards those problems. They need to be directed towards those problems. And that's going to take courage. It's going to take courage from politicians that recognize that it can't be business as usual. I mean, that the social problems that we are confronted with have to be addressed at the deepest levels. If they are not, I mean, I believe that this generation is going to be a defining generation for future generations. Because we are now confronted with elements that we've never been confronted with before. The proliferation of technology has enabled individuals to inflict the harm that pre-modern armies were not capable of inflicting. So nuclear weapons, the proliferation of these weapons, and now the possibility of dirty bombs and suitcases, where is this all leading to? I think it's going to eventually erode the civil liberties in these societies, that the very things that our ancestors fought to ensure that we might have are going to disappear slowly or quickly. And so I really feel that looking and addressing the real issues. And in this country, I know that one of the major issues that you're confronted with is race. And I would remind you that Arnold Toynbee said, if we do not solve the race problem, and he said this in 1947, if we do not solve the race problem, then I fear that the militant spirit of Islam will once again be awakened, even if it slept like the companions of the cave for 300 years. The militant spirit of Islam will be awakened. And it will challenge this minority that has for so long been controlling large parts of the wealth of the earth and not sharing them with other parts of the world. And I think that that is really one of the greatest dangers that we're facing, is that the Muslims now, the resentment has built up to such a degree that you're dealing with a rage element. There will be a fire, and it might be to a degree that we won't be able to extinguish it. And I don't mean to say that in any threatening way, but in a really sincere way, in a warning, because I've lived amongst the Muslims and I've seen the type of resentment. And Nietzsche reminded us in the last century that resentment was a ticking time bomb in the human self. And so I think that what we need to do is diffuse this resentment. And the only way that can be done is by goodwill. And I really truly believe this. I believe that human beings have an immense capacity to forgive. I think they have an immense capacity to forgive. But there must be an apology. There must be a recognition that they have been wronged, that they have been harmed. And I think just in simply doing that, and I asked one of the advisors to Tony Blair just to simply send that message, that if we would truly just admit that people have suffered and just look at their suffering in a real way, I think that that admittance alone would do so much to diffuse a lot of the built-up resentment and rage. And I think a lot of these young people here who have come to these countries, migrated to these countries, their fathers or their grandfathers brought them to these countries, and they were born into these countries, not of their own choosing, but they have come here and they want to be part of these societies. But if that hand of friendship is not offered to them in some sincere way, without looking on them with contempt, without seeing them as less than you, without seeing them somehow as people that are tainted by their genetics or by their color. And of all people on these islands, I think the Welsh people, the Irish people, are more capable of recognizing that because of their own treatment in the past. So I really feel that if you extend your hand to these people, that you're going to see immense things. And I would hope that this country here, Wales, become a model for Europe. I really think that you can become a model in race relations and in social work that you would be proud of and that you can in turn extend to other peoples. So I would really hope that you take serious the indigenous community. If we want to extinguish the fire of terrorism, I think the first thing that we have to do is recognize that we have kindling in our own societies. And it needs to be recognized and it needs to be addressed. And these are the disenfranchised youth of these societies, of the United Kingdom, of Wales, of Scotland. It's not the Arabs now that have come here, the Omar Bakris and the Abu Hamzas. It's the Saids and the Abdullahs that are growing up in Manchester, in Bradford, in Leeds, in Glasgow, and here in Cardiff. And I think that these youth, they need to be given hope. They need to be given visions of possibility. And so I would just end by saying, I've kept this rather broad, and I think that, above all, just coming together and allowing this opportunity for a Muslim who is also an American, and I really do feel in some ways I grew up in the best of the Western tradition. My father was a humanities teacher. And then I went to the Muslim world and I studied their tradition and came to love that tradition, and I'm devoted to that tradition without abandoning my own tradition. And I don't see them as mutually exclusive. I believe that the best that we have in the West is in essence contained and crystallized in the Islamic teaching. I think the very principles that we have, those ideals that we hold the highest, those are the same ideals that the Muslims adhere to as well. And I think that there is immense possibility for conciliation, immense possibility for conviviality, but it's going to take an immense effort from ourselves. And I really feel that as human beings, we have proven ourselves in the past of addressing the problems and surmounting them. And I think we're capable of doing it today, but it's going to need a lot of work. One of the ways in which I'm trying to do that is to start, we founded a seminary in California that is attempting to train indigenous Muslim scholars that are here to be productive members and not destructive members of society. And I would love to see that in Wales. I would love to see an Islamic seminary, and I've told them that I hope to be part of that, to help them develop that. And I think that we can train from Wales, we can train young men and women in the true Islamic tradition, which is a tradition of peace. It's a tradition of concord and harmony. And it's a tradition that I believe that we in the West can still learn an immense amount from. And I would just end this by, I was reminded of the poem by Robert Frost in which he said that some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. And I think that these two destructive elements on the planet, desire, greed, and hate and resentment, if we don't seriously take them seriously and overcome them, they will be our downfall. Thank you very much.